DEI, ESG, WTF, Shark Tank mogul and former Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban got into it with a number of conservatives online over Cuban's view that DEI initiatives were positive for businesses. He was responding to a comment made by Elon Musk that, quote, discrimination on the basis of race, which DEI does, is literally the definition of racism. Cuban said, good businesses look where others don't to find the employees that will put your business in the best possible position to succeed. You may not agree, but I take it as a given that there are people of various races, ethnicities, orientation, etc., that are regularly excluded from hiring consideration. By extending our hiring search to include them, we can find people that are more qualified. The loss of DEI-phobic companies is my gain. To which Musk responded, cool. So when should we expect to see a short, white, Asian woman on the Mavs?
In a separate attack on DEI efforts, Lululemon founder Chip Wilson told Forbes that the company was, quote, trying to become like Gap, everything to everybody. And I think the definition of a brand is that you're not everything to everybody. You've got to be clear that you don't want certain customers coming in. A company spokesperson clarified Wilson does not speak on behalf of Lululemon. Here now to discuss the decline, seemingly, of ESG is Will Hild, the Executive Director of Consumers Research. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So if you're someone like Lululemon and you do want to become like Gap, everything to everyone, I mean, you've got to reach markets of people that may not look like your initial team of founders. You may have to hire people from the demographics that you aim to market the products to. I can imagine trying to market a product to a certain demographic, something that's super common for a company, and not even knowing what to do because you don't have people on your team who represent that demographic. Could it be reasonable that DEI is actually good for business, or is that a stretch in your opinion?
Well, what I would say, and you saw that in Mark Cuban's tweet as well, is that the proponents of DEI and ESG like to play word games, sort of a Mott and Bailey approach, where they'll throw out DEI and then define it in a way that is the normal course of how business is done. Long before DEI or ESG acronyms were used in this country, people hired marketing departments to look at demographics that they currently didn't sell their product in and figure out how they could market those products to those new demographics and have a broader appeal to the market. That's not anything new. That didn't come with DEI. That didn't come with ESG. So I would say those are different questions, whether a company like Lululemon that's trying to have a broader appeal might want to hire marketers that can get them into different demographics, or whether they should have a DEI department that focuses their company not on their customers, but on racial and sex-based grievances, on focusing on bean counting around race and sex, that's what DEI departments do. Those are two separate questions. And I would say the first is great. The second, the DEI, is horrible, anti-American, and I think companies are quickly coming to realize that.
Yeah, Will. So when I was reading Mark Cuban's argument on X with some conservatives, I think a common response to him was what you're talking about as DEI is not what DEI is in practice. In your experience and in your work, you come across a lot of these DEI programs. How do they actually work in practice?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And another person that responded to Mark Cuban was David Ackman, the hedge fund billionaire who kind of led the charge against Claudine Gay and some of the other university presidents that had been pushing DEI. And what he said is, I thought the same thing too, Mark, when I was paying for DEI departments at these universities as a philanthropist. But when I looked into it, when I actually looked at what they were doing, it was the opposite of trying to find people from diverse backgrounds and of opinions and viewpoints. It was just a monomaniacal focus on bean counting race and sex and sexual orientation and elevating people, as we saw in the case of President Gay at Harvard, elevating people who had not risen of their own merits, and in fact, in spite of ethical and plagiarism issues that they had in their career, but simply on these race and sex-based demographic questions, right? So what we see in corporations is that's how they operate inside. And the additional thing, I always get asked as we push back on companies doing this is, why did they start it in the first place? If it's just a waste of money, why did they include it? And what we see is that's where the DEI and the ESG is tied in together. We saw a large number of asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard who are pushing politics into the corporate boardroom and pushing these companies to start DEI departments that really don't focus on the consumer. They focus on pushing a progressive left political agenda.
I want to back up a little bit here, Will. Are you saying, Claudine Gay's rise to become president of Harvard was because of her identity as a black woman?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. Harvard admitted that when they began their search, excuse me, that led to President Gay being picked, they put parameters around the search based on certain DEI criteria. So there's no question about it. They themselves admit that was part of the search, and that's part of what David Ackman was criticizing, is that it's actually the opposite of what Cuban is saying. It's not, hey, let's open the doors and look for people of merit where we haven't been looking before. It's let's close down certain areas. Let's say we're not going to pick a white male this time, regardless of who's got the most merit or the best resume. We're only going to look in these narrow demographic channels.
Can you dive a little bit? Go ahead, Jessica.
Are you saying that it was impossible that there was anyone of merit who was a black woman, that limiting it to that pool based on identity meant that there would be no one eligible with, if we consider merits, to be president of Harvard?
No, not at all. But if what Cuban is saying, what people are advocating for, is to find the best talent for a job, you don't want to filter by race and sex and all these things that we consider to be extraneous to that question. You'd want to find the best candidate. And that's not what Harvard did. They filtered by race and sex. So it's not that there aren't any black women who have talent. That's a ridiculous thing to even suggest. It's that if you're looking for the best person, what you shouldn't do is say, let's filter by black and filter by woman. Let's look at all of the candidates that we're Harvard. They could have gotten, theoretically pulled from anywhere in the United States, the best talent. It's absurd to simply exclude large portions of the country simply by race and sex, which is, again, the opposite of how Mr. Cuban was defining DEI.
Yeah, and I think you can also look at Claudine Gay's history of academic output and see that it was incredibly thin compared to other previous Harvard presidents. But I want to go into this ESG question. You brought it up earlier as being connected to DEI. How exactly does ESG create incentives for companies to adopt these DEI policies? Is it we won't invest in you if you don't do this, or what exactly is the incentive structure there?
That is a fantastic question, because ESG and DEI are really just tentacles of the same animal. You have these large asset managers like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard who have trillions of dollars of assets. It's not their money, it's ours, it's state, local, federal pension funds. And they use it to push their own political agenda in these boardrooms. And the mechanism of that is that they can hire and fire directors because of the large number of shares of these companies that they control, especially when they coordinate, as they have done against a number of different companies. They can really pick who's going to run the company. And so if the person won't play ball with their political agenda, they can have that person fired. We've seen this specifically noted by Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. He made a now infamous statement in a 2017 interview where he said that at BlackRock, we believe in forcing behaviors, and we use our assets under management to force behaviors. He was specifically talking about race and sex-based quotas for boards of directors. So this is literally ESG pushing DEI in the corporate boardroom, and then they will punish companies that don't, enlarge their DEI department big enough to Larry's satisfaction.
So when I think about ESG, environmental, social, corporate governance, I think about the longevity of a shareholder's investment. If they're investing in a company that might pollute the planet and they want to consider, okay, well, there's no economy at all and there's no returns to be gained if we destroy the planet. I mean, that sounds like not just a political agenda, but also something that an investor or shareholder would consider when investing in a company that jeopardizes the planet.
Absolutely. And we get back to that initial statement I made where ESG and DEI try to latch onto things that companies have been doing for decades, for centuries, longer than ESG has been around. You're 100% right. You should absolutely consider the long-term environmental impact of a company if they've got an issue with, like BP had, where they had an oil spill. The interesting thing about the E in ESG is it actually covers for problems like that. When you actually look at the metrics that go into the E, it's a monomaniacal focus on so-called net zero carbon emission targets for these companies. And many of these companies, for example, electric vehicle companies or companies that are getting into the electric vehicle space, have serious significant issues with the cobalt that is mined for this, coming out of open pit mines in the Congo, staffed by 12-year-old child, effectively slaves, that is mining this cobalt. It has been moved. Almost all of these heavy metals are processed in China, where there aren't nearly the same environmental protections for this kind of stuff, and then brought here to be in these batteries. And yet none of that is factored into most of these ESG ratings, especially the ones coming out of big companies like BlackRock, because they are monomaniacally focused. So they will give a high E rating to a company that is moving into electric vehicles, even though it creates all kinds of other environmental problems that maybe worse, arguably are, than their carbon emissions from a normal internal combustion engine. So I agree. I do think you should look at a company, the full spectrum. You should look at the long-term prospects. But ESG is actually there to cover for those things, to hide some of the skeletons and the problems in these companies, which is why some of the most, I always say it's a refuge for charlatans, because that's why some of these companies are okay to go along with ESG, because it actually covers for their problems.
Will Hild, Executive Director of Consumers Research, thank you so much for joining us on Rising today.
Thanks so much for having me on.